Last week, we learned that Isaiah 40 through 55 emphasizes God's faithfulness to his people. But these chapters also emphasize God's faithfulness to his servant. Now, as we're going to observe this morning, sometimes identifying who that servant is more difficult than it seems. But that is actually part of the prophet's rhetorical strategy. It helps the prophet to unfold for God's people God's plan for their salvation. So let's begin right there, right where we were just talking about, at the ambiguous identity of the servant. And really here we're focusing on verses 1 through 6. And as you're reading through this text, you start reading verse 1, and you think to yourself, okay, this is a little different than the passages we read last week, where the servant was clearly the people of Israel. This seems to be a person. And you read through verse 2, and it seems to confirm your suspicion that the prophet is writing from the perspective of a person who has been commissioned by God to be his servant. The Eved Yahweh is the Hebrew phrase, servant of the Lord. But then you get to verse 3, where in the prophet's recounting, the Lord addresses his servant. And he says, "You are my servant, Israel." So you're kind of thinking, well, okay, this is a little weird. I guess we're talking about Israel. But then you come back to verse 4 and you're like, oh, okay, we're back to a person again. But the Lord said that this was Israel, so we must be talking about a person as a metaphor for the nation or something. What's going on here? But then you come to verses 5 and 6, and everything starts to become clear. Because the Lord says to his servant, this is what I'm going to do through you. And part of that task is bringing back the descendants of Jacob, the people of Israel, to their God. God is speaking to the prophet, and the prophet is an idealized representative of Israel. The prophet himself stands for Israel. He is, in a sense, the quintessential Israelite. Sort of like Moses. But in fact, given everything that this servant is going to do, even the prophet himself is a metaphor. Indeed, both Israel and the prophet are what I would call anticipatory metaphors for the Messiah. Now again, the word Messiah or anointed one is not used in this text. It's only what we see the servant doing that points us in that direction. But it is an unmistakable direction. The servant of the Lord points us in the direction of this ultimate servant who in many ways, like when we were talking about Matthew's gospel, we talked about this, who in many ways recapitulates the life of Israel and the life of her prophets in his own life. Israel wandered in the desert for 40 years. Elijah hung out in the wilderness for 40 days. Jesus does the same. And there are numerous other examples where that comes from. Now, as I said, this ambiguous identity helps us understand the unfolding plan of God. But there's something else we need to look at first. And that is the unambiguous commitment of God. Now, that commitment unfolds in three veins, or has three recipients, if you will. First of all, God is faithful to His servant. Now, we could creep on down to verse 8, verse 9, and kind of unpack some of that faithfulness there. But I actually want us to look at verse 4. And I want us to look at verse 4 in a little bit of detail so that we kind of understand how the prophet himself perceives this faithfulness. Look at verse 4 there. The prophet speaks of his own ministry with some level of despair. He acknowledges up front the fruitlessness of his work. It's like trying to grow rice in a desert, right? There's nothing there. He acknowledges that there just seems to be a giant pile of nothingness as the result of all of his labor. And yet, look at the second half of that verse. The prophet acknowledges his despair, and yet his faith is in God. As you're looking there at the second half of verse 4, you see that there are two stanzas. The first stanza, the NIV translates it as, "What is due to me is in the hands of the Lord." Mm-hmm. A lot of translations actually render that as, "My justice is in the hands of the Lord." In an ancient context, it's a similar idea. What is due to us, what we deserve in a sort of a civil law sense. It's an anachronistic distinction, but it's one that I think C.S. Lewis uses to great effect in his reflections on the Psalms. It applies here too. This justice is not sort of in the New Testament sense of, what I deserve, because as the Christian rapper Lecrae Moore rightly observed, if we got what we deserved, we'd all be in hell tonight. No, it's more in a sort of a civil law sense. We have put in all this labor, and we deserve certain output from that labor. And the conclusion is reinforced by the second stanza. My reward is with God. The notion of reward being related to almost to pay for services. He trusts that God is keeping the books and that God will not ignore the labor that he has put in, even if that labor seems fruitless in the present. Then there is God's commitment to his people. I love Hosea 11 on this point. It kind of takes a lot of what's going on in our passage and unpacks it. Verses 1 through 7 are really a catalog of Israel's sins. That's why I put verse 7 as the beginning point of the verse that I quoted to you on the screen. God unpacks this whole laundry list of charges against his people that basically boil down to they give a whole lot of lip service to him, but the truth is they are unfaithful. Again and again and again and again. But then in verses 8 and following, God says, doggone it, but how can I give you up? How can I do this calamity that I have been promising? How can I bring this upon you? Now, Hosea is one of our earliest writing prophets, so we know that the calamities do come. But you just have this outpouring, this bursting forth of God's compassion for his people. It is a compassion that even at this point is utterly undeserved. And yet, it is real. It is that kind of compassion that innervates God's commitment. This is not a mere sort of legalistic, well, this is my obligation, so this is what I'm going to do. No, it is a commitment that is motivated by God's heart. But God is not simply faithful to his servant or to his people. He is faithful to his purpose. And what is that purpose? It is the world. Indeed, from a Christian point of view, and there are even some Orthodox Jewish scholars who would agree with this, from a Christian point of view, it has always been the world. And God remains faithful to that purpose. We see that especially in verse 6. So, in light of God's commitment, what's he going to do? What will be the results of God's faithfulness? Well, they fall out into two categories. Results for the servant and results that God will accomplish through the servant. That is, for his people, for the world, etc. So let's start with for the servant. And those consequences really have their root in this first one. God has chosen, will choose, the servant as the recipient of his favor. And when you hear that word favor, you should think grace. Notice, I think it's down in verse 9, the association between that word favor and the word salvation. It is God's favor that leads to salvation. But for the servant, it does far more. It leads to the expansion of his ministry. God is, you can almost see God smirking in that, kind of Cheshire cat, mischievous kind of way. Yeah, redeeming the people of Israel, that's too small of a task for you. I've got bigger things for you. Right? I've got bigger things in mind for you. It also results, in an elevation of the servant's status. There in verses 8 and 9, you have this contrast between the servant who is pictured as in the present having a low status, one who is looked down upon by the high status people of this world. And God says to that servant, yeah, but I'm going to reverse all that. All those kings and princes who look down on you now, they will show you respect in the future. I'll repeat what I said last week and what I've said many times over. This is a very status-conscious society. And by pointing out this elevated status in the eyes of others, God is assuring the servant of an elevated identity. And then what's the fourth thing that he does for the servant? He promises that he will strengthen him and that he will help him, that he will rescue him. Now, don't pass by that too quickly, because that's going to be a source of tension with next week's message, where we're talking about the suffering servant. But God here promises to help the servant. And that is no small thing. Believe me, as one who stands before you every week, I can tell you, to do this task, at least to do it responsibly and faithfully, requires the Lord's help. And indeed, that is true of anyone who leads the people of God. Whether it be Natalia leading us in worship, or Beth Moore leading people through her own books and blogs, etc., or whether it be, Todd Still, dean at Truett Seminary. Whatever person that you want to mention who leads the people of God with integrity, they can only do so with God's help. Now, what is it that God accomplishes through the servant? Well, the key to understanding that is right there in, I think it's verse 9, when he says to the servant, I will make you a covenant for the people. Berit is the Hebrew word. You could translate it promise, but we'll just keep it as covenant. Okay? Now, some translators, the New English Translation does this, some translators see that and they go, well, that doesn't really make sense. A person can't be a covenant, so we'll render this as covenant mediator. Well, the problem is the word mediator isn't there. And while it's possible that the prophet means a covenant mediator, I don't think that's actually what he's trying to do. And I think we should always, whenever we see something odd like that in the text, our first instinct should be, well, could this make sense? Is there something that God is trying to do where he's breaking our categories? And I think that's what he's doing here. This servant becomes an embodiment of the covenant that God has made with his people. He becomes an embodiment of the promise that God has made to his people. Boy, we could sit and plumb the depths of that for a while, couldn't we? But what I want you to do is I want you to meditate on that and on everything that means as we observe that in this text, it becomes the foundation for the reconstitution of the nation. That's what most of verses 10 through 13 is about. It's about bringing the people back together and bringing them back to God and providing all of the means that they will need to do so. Lowering the mountains, raising up the highways. Sounds like I-20 near Ranger here, That's what you're doing. You're making it possible. You're putting sources of food along the way. There's a grill in a gas station near the Gilbert Pecan Company. They do a mean burger, you know. You're making travel possible. God is bringing the people together. And notice, He's not just bringing them to Himself. He's bringing them together. And He's bringing them back to the land, this covenant place. He's doing even more than that. He is liberating those who suffer. The imagery, even though the word prison isn't really quite here, you'll see some translations use it in this text. The word prison or dungeon really isn't quite here, but the imagery is of a prison. And can you imagine, before electric lights, how dark was a prison? The NIV uses the imagery of darkness a lot here in its translation. That darkness was a place of despair. It was a place of fear. It was a place of suffering. It was a place, if you want to be philosophical about it, it was a place of non-being. It was a place that anticipated the traditional Hebrew notion of Sheol, the place of the dead. And God is saying to those who find themselves in that kind of darkness, and I do think He does mean literally, but I think He also means metaphorically, that He will call them out through this servant. And then He says that there will be salvation for the nations, and that even the entire creation will worship, anticipating a connection that Paul will make in Romans 8:19-22. Now, if you'll notice there in verse 13, the worship comes as a result of God's people receiving compassion, receiving mercy. What is that all about? I think part of it really is that God is keeping His promise, and that God is showing compassion. And that is worthy of worship. So how do we draw all of this together? And how do we make it kind of a springboard for our further reflections on the servant next week? Well, let's repeat something that we said at the beginning. Observing the ambiguity surrounding the identity of the servant helps us to understand the Messiah's identity and ministry. Okay? Just as the prophet functions as the ideal Israelite, discharging the task given to Israel in Genesis 12:1-3, so also Jesus takes upon Himself the identity not only of Israel, but of the prophet. He is the Israelite par excellence, and He is the prophet par excellence, discharging the task that God has given to Him. And as we look forward to the New Testament, we can state that another way. Matthew emphasizes Jesus' role of bringing the descendants of Jacob back to their God. John emphasizes Jesus' role as light to the entire world. They are both core to His identity. Now, one other thing that we need to observe is that the promises that are made to the servant could be a stumbling block to faith in Christ. And after all, just reading the servant's song of Isaiah 53, much less thinking about what eventually happened to Jesus, might make you go, I'm not so sure God can be trusted. But I think you can read that whole unfolding drama the other way. I think that in fact, it is this previous promise of faithfulness to the servant that carries Jesus through the suffering that is narrated in Isaiah 50 and 53. Without that previous promise, it's hard to carry through. As C.S. Lewis observes, every vocation, if it's worth its salt, if it's actually a vocation, costs us something. It doesn't matter what that vocation is. If your vocation is that you are a football player, you make a lot of sacrifices, not only in terms of your body on game day, but in terms of what you eat, how you exercise, how you sleep. There are sacrifices that you have to make all along the way. If you are a United States Marine, you make certain sacrifices. It's just part and parcel of it. I saw a documentary one time. I don't remember if it was the Marine Corps or the Army. They were doing some mountain warfare training with these recruits that were not yet certified for mountain warfare. And they send them through all of this cold weather testing. I mean, these guys, they're not eating enough. They're cold all the time. And you get to the end of it, and they've passed. They've all passed. It's really great. And you're thinking, all right, these guys deserve a nice hot meal. What do they get? Ham and cheese sandwiches. That's just part and parcel of being a soldier, of being a Marine. You make sacrifices. If you're a medical professional, there are sacrifices that you make. It doesn't matter what your vocation is. The vocation of being the servant of the Lord, one could argue, requires the suffering narrated in Isaiah 50 and 53. And therefore, it is the promises of Isaiah 49 that carries him through. Does that have application to you and me? Yes. Why? Because we participate in the life of Jesus. When we, as Paul puts it in Philippians 4, when we know him in his suffering, we also know him as the recipient of promise. And as Paul will emphasize in Galatians, we too are recipients of promise. Let us pray.